The woods were quieter than they should have been. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid to disturb whatever lingered among the black pines. I had been warned not to come here, not to follow the trail that vanished beneath rotting leaves and creeping moss, not to search for the woman who once walked out of these trees with a swollen belly and a story no one dared repeat aloud. Yet here I was, standing before the sagging door of her cabin, staring at the place where she claimed her husband had lived and where the town whispered her son had died. The smell of damp timber and old smoke clung to the air as I stepped inside. Dust floated like pale ash through a sliver of moonlight that cut across the room. The hearth was cold, but someone had lived here long after the locals believed the cabin abandoned. Blankets were disturbed, floorboards scratched as though dragged by restless feet. I had come searching for answers, but the silence that pressed in from the walls felt like a warning, urging me to turn back before the woods decided I knew too much. They said the woman had been peculiar from the beginning, that she kept to herself, raising a quiet boy who shadowed her every movement. But the real fear began years later, when she returned from the forest alone, trembling, and impossibly pregnant. She told the sheriff the father was her husband, but the townsfolk insisted she had no husband at all, only the pale, sickly son who followed her everywhere and vanished into the trees on the night she conceived. As I stood in the dim cabin, my lantern flickering, I realized the truth was not buried out there in old rumors. It was here, in these walls, in the floor that creaked beneath unseen weight, in the forest that seemed to breathe against the windows. And whatever nightmare had twisted this family into something the town refused to name, it hadn't ended with their disappearance. It was waiting. And now it knew I had come. The stranger's arrival was not marked by any grand announcement, yet his presence rippled quietly through the small woodland town like a cold draft seeping under a locked door. He stepped off the rattling bus just after dawn, carrying nothing but a worn satchel and a determination he seemed to wear like a second skin. His coat was creased, his boots covered in dust from miles he had walked before ever reaching the road that led into town, and though his expression was unreadable, the locals sensed immediately that he was not here by accident. People in this town knew how to mind their business, knew how to look away from things that threatened their fragile sense of peace, but as he crossed the cracked pavement of the only main street, they watched him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Outsiders rarely came here, and those who did never stayed long enough to learn why the forest felt thicker than it should or why certain stories were spoken only in low voices after nightfall. He didn't stop at the general store or ask for directions like most travelers. Instead, he walked straight for the sheriff's office, a squat wooden building with peeling paint and a porch that leaned slightly to the left. The old sheriff stiffened when the stranger stepped inside. It wasn't fear so much as recognition, as though he'd expected this moment and dreaded it in equal measure. The stranger asked about the woman who had once emerged from the woods pregnant and half-mad with exhaustion, the woman who claimed her husband had vanished yet never explained where he had come from or why her story contradicted every known fact about her life. The sheriff responded cautiously, saying she had disappeared years ago and that it was best to leave old tragedies buried, but the stranger only nodded, as if the warning were nothing more than an expected formality. He produced a faded photograph from his satchel, an image of the same woman standing in front of a weather-beaten cabin, and asked where he might find the place. The sheriff hesitated, eyes narrowing, before finally muttering that the cabin still stood deep within the woods, though it was better left alone. When the stranger stepped back outside, the town already felt tighter around him, as if the very air had changed in his brief absence. He sensed the weight of every stare, every whisper drifting behind him as though the townsfolk feared he might awaken something they'd worked hard to forget. But he continued toward the tree line anyway, following a path that grew thinner with each step, driven by a purpose he had never fully explained to anyone, perhaps not even to himself. The whispers about the hollow cabin carried a kind of reluctant reverence, as though the place itself had earned a reputation that no one dared challenge. It wasn't an official name, not one that appeared on any map or record, yet everyone in town knew exactly what it referenced. The cabin sat somewhere deep within the oldest stretch of the pines, a part of the forest where sunlight rarely broke through the canopy and where the air seemed thicker, almost syrupy with damp earth and something older. Children were raised with strict warnings never to wander too far in that direction, and even adults spoke about the area with lowered voices, claiming the woods grew strangely silent the closer one got. The stranger heard these murmurs almost immediately after leaving the sheriff's office, catching fragments of nervous conversations as he passed the bakery, the mechanic's shop, and the diner where a few early risers sat with steaming mugs they no longer bothered bringing to their lips. Some pretended not to notice him as he approached, but the more the stranger asked, the more the town's reluctance became clear. An elderly man outside the post office muttered something about bad blood that doesn't stay buried, while a middle-aged woman hauling a crate of apples insisted the place was cursed, though she refused to elaborate. A pair of teenage boys, emboldened by each other's presence, whispered that screams were once heard echoing from the trees late at night, a claim they later denied when pressed. No one provided a clear explanation, only warnings layered with unease, as if the truth was too tangled or too dangerous to share outright. The stranger noticed the tension each time he uttered the cabin's name, how shoulders tightened and eyes darted toward the forest as though expecting it to respond. He eventually encountered a retired logger who had spent decades working near the forest's edge. The man's face was weathered, his hands thick with old scars, but it was the way he glanced over his shoulder before speaking that revealed how deeply the woods unsettled even those who once made a living from them. He claimed the cabin had belonged to a woman who kept herself separated from the rest of town, living with a boy no one saw grow up, only appear one day as a pale, fragile child who never spoke a word. Some said the boy was not hers. Others insisted he was, but in a way no one could accept. The logger said the cabin felt wrong back then, but after the pair vanished, the forest seemed to swallow it even deeper. Still, on certain mist-heavy mornings, he swore he saw a faint plume of smoke rising far beyond where any normal trail led, as if the cabin were breathing in the shadows. The stranger listened to every word, knowing instinctively that these half-whispered warnings were not meant to scare him away but to prepare him for something the town itself feared to confront. The journal was found almost by accident, though later the stranger would wonder if the cabin had wanted him to find it. After pushing through a tangle of low branches and ducking beneath fallen beams, he stepped into what had once been a kitchen, the boards warped from years of rain sneaking through the roof. Dust coated everything like a thick, undisturbed frost, yet one small drawer in a crooked cabinet seemed oddly clean, as if someone had opened it not too long ago. Inside lay the journal, its leather cover cracked, edges curled, pages swollen from moisture. When he picked it up, the faint scent of mildew rose, mixing with the sharper smell of old smoke that clung to the cabin walls. He flipped it open, half expecting the ink to be smeared beyond recognition, but the writing remained strangely legible, though tremulous, as if the hand that wrote it never stopped shaking. The entries began abruptly, offering no introduction or explanation, only fragmented accounts of a woman's daily life with a boy she called her son. The earliest pages described him as sickly, plagued by fevers that came without warning and vanished just as inexplicably. She wrote about how he clung to her with a kind of desperate attachment that deepened as he grew older. He disliked strangers, recoiled from bright light, and refused to leave the cabin unless she went with him. The stranger noticed how the tone of her writing shifted over time. At first, she seemed concerned, devoted, almost painfully protective, but as the entries progressed, her words turned restless, then fearful, as if she had begun to see something in the boy that she could not understand. She mentioned strange occurrences that she tried to dismiss as dreams, hearing footsteps around the cabin even when the boy slept soundly beside the hearth, waking up to find the windows open despite bolting them the night before, discovering marks on the floor as if something heavy had been dragged across it. The boy's dependence, too, changed in ways she struggled to articulate. He watched her constantly, even when she thought him asleep, and she described moments when his gaze felt older, heavier, almost as though someone else looked out through his eyes. She seemed desperate for help yet terrified of seeking it, convinced the town already judged her too harshly. The final readable entry before the ink dissolved into water stains revealed her growing certainty that the boy's sickness was not illness at all but something inherited, something that traced back to a history she had spent her life trying to escape. She wrote that there were secrets buried in her bloodline, tangled and poisonous, and she feared the boy had begun to unravel them in ways she no longer had the strength to control. Rumors about the man's disappearance began long before anyone was willing to speak them aloud. The stranger pieced together the story only through scattered conversations, each offering a slightly different version, yet all of them circling the same unsettling truth. The boy who had grown into a man had vanished without a trace, and nobody in town mourned him the way one might expect. What struck the stranger first was how uncertain the townsfolk seemed about the man's age at the time he disappeared. Some claimed he was barely grown, still with the gaunt face and quiet presence of a youth, while others insisted he looked older than his years. His features hardened into something uncanny by the time he stopped appearing in the clearing behind the cabin. The contradiction didn't feel like faulty memory but rather like the entire community had chosen not to look too closely, not to examine what made them uncomfortable. The stories described him as strange, withdrawn, and unsteady on his feet, as though always recovering from an illness that never fully released him. He rarely came into town, and when he did, it was only to stand by his mother, if she truly was his mother, while she gathered supplies before hurrying back into the woods. Some swore they never once heard him speak. Others said he spoke too softly, his voice thin and wavering like someone whispering to themselves rather than addressing another person. Whatever the truth, he was always seen in her shadow, as though he existed only where she allowed him to. Then, one day, he stopped coming altogether. The woman walked into town alone, shoulders tense, eyes darting as if expecting someone to follow her. When asked where the boy, now a man, had gone, she said he had simply left, wandered into the woods one night and never returned. Her explanation was vague, delivered without conviction, as though she were repeating words she didn't believe. The sheriff later admitted she had seemed more relieved than distressed, though he'd never dared ask why. After that, the locals concluded the man had died in the forest, succumbing to whatever affliction had haunted him since childhood. But none of those accounts aligned with the whispers heard after sunset. Several townsfolk claimed they heard footsteps near the tree line long after the man had supposedly vanished, slow and deliberate, pacing as though searching for something. A few even claimed to see a figure standing deep among the trees, barely visible yet unmistakably tall and unmoving, watching the town in complete silence. No one ever worked up the courage to approach. Whether out of fear or guilt, they chose instead to pretend he had passed on, even as the woods told a different story. When the woman finally reappeared, it was as if the forest had spat her out after years of trying to consume her. She emerged just before dusk, staggering down the dirt road with her clothes clinging to her like damp rags, her hair tangled in long strands that looked almost woven with pine needles. People who saw her first didn't recognize her immediately. She had grown thinner, her skin pale and stretched tight across her face, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. But the most startling detail, the one that made several townsfolk freeze in place, was her swollen belly. She was unmistakably pregnant, far along, yet no one could recall seeing her with another human being in years. The man who had once lived with her, the one locals whispered about in frightened tones, had been gone for so long that some believed he had never truly existed. Others claimed he haunted the woods still. But no one believed she had been with another soul since his disappearance. Word spread fast. By the time she reached the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered, keeping their distance as though she carried something contagious. She trembled as she spoke, insisting in a shaky voice that the father of the child was her husband. The sheriff felt his stomach sink. Everyone in town knew she had no husband, at least not one that anyone had ever met or could confirm. When pressed gently, she repeated herself as though it were the only explanation she could offer, operating on instinct rather than truth. The sheriff noted how her eyes darted toward the forest whenever she paused, as if she feared something might emerge from between the trees at any moment. The town doctor refused outright to examine her. He claimed his hands were too unsteady now, but the truth was evident in the way he backed into the shadows when she approached. Years earlier, he had treated the same family, and whatever he had witnessed during those visits had never left him. He muttered that the woman carried burdens older than she knew, and that the child inside her was a consequence of misfortune no one should attempt to unravel. The townsfolk whispered that she looked relieved when the doctor refused, almost grateful not to be touched or questioned further. Despite her frail appearance, she insisted she had been living peacefully, that she had not seen or heard from her missing son or husband or whoever the man was to her. Yet her voice quivered whenever she denied contact, and her fingers tightened protectively around her belly as though shielding it from the very questions being asked. The stranger, watching from the edge of the crowd, noticed the way she flinched at sudden noises, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to step out from the gathering gloom. It wasn't fear of people that haunted her, it was fear of something that had followed her out of the woods, something she could not name but carried with her all the same. The doctor's refusal became one of the clearest signs that something about the woman's pregnancy unsettled the town in ways no one wanted to discuss. He was a man who had delivered children in dimly lit cabins during winter storms, who had stitched up hunters mauled by animals all across the hills, who had seen enough hardship to dull the sharpness of fear. Yet when the woman arrived at his clinic, pale and trembling, he reacted not with concern or professional distance but with a kind of visceral recoil that startled even those who had known him all their lives. His hands, normally steady with years of practiced calm, trembled slightly as he stepped back, shaking his head before she even finished her request. He told her he was too old now, that his eyesight wasn't what it used to be and that she would be better off finding someone younger, someone with sharper senses. But the excuses sounded thin, brittle at the edges, as though they had been stitched together in haste. The woman didn't protest. If anything, she seemed almost relieved, lowering her gaze to the worn floorboards as if expecting his refusal. The onlookers, however, exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the doctor. They knew how deeply he valued his duty. For him to deny care to a heavily pregnant woman was unthinkable, unless something far worse lay behind his decision. After she left the clinic, the stranger approached the doctor privately, hoping to understand what had driven such a drastic reaction. But the doctor grew tense, his jaw set as though clamping down on memories that had never lost their bite. He admitted, finally, that years ago he had been called to that cabin deep in the woods. The woman had been younger then, worn but not broken, living with the boy she called her son. The doctor hinted at an atmosphere inside the cabin that had unsettled him the moment he crossed the threshold, an oppressive stillness, as though the place itself resented any outsider. He described the boy's frail frame, the way he watched with an expression that didn't suit his age, and how every time the doctor tried to leave, it felt like something in the room urged him to stay or return. He never explained the details of the treatments he provided, only that he had walked away from that cabin with the unshakable sense that something was deeply wrong, not in a physical sense but in ways he couldn't name. He admitted he had vowed never to go back, and the pregnancy, emerging after years of isolation and mystery, confirmed a fear he had tried to bury. There were some histories, he said, that should never be prodded open again. His voice dropped to a whisper, cracking slightly as he said that whatever lived in that family's bloodline had taken root long before the woman showed up at his clinic, and he feared that tending to her now would invite the past to return with a vengeance. The discovery of the buried birth certificate came almost by accident, yet it became the first piece of tangible evidence suggesting that everything the woman had claimed or avoided claiming was far from the truth. While searching the overgrown path behind the cabin, the stranger noticed a section of earth that seemed recently disturbed, softer than the rest and covered with a thin dusting of pine needles that didn't match the surrounding ground. Curious, he knelt and brushed the layer aside, uncovering a small metal tin half rusted through. It was barely large enough to hold a handful of papers, yet its placement felt intentional, as though someone had hidden it in a hurry and hoped the forest would swallow it whole. The lid creaked when he pried it open, revealing documents wrapped tightly in oilcloth. Most were ruined beyond recognition, their ink blurred into black stains, but one sheet, folded neatly, protected more carefully, remained legible enough to draw breath from the stranger's lungs. The birth certificate listed the woman as the mother, but the space for the father's name was left blank. That alone was not unusual for rural records of earlier decades, but what caught the stranger's eye was the date. According to the document, the boy she had raised had been born at a time that simply did not align with the age he appeared when the town first saw him. If the certificate were accurate, he should have been a child, barely able to walk, not the pale, quiet youth described by the villagers. Yet the handwriting, the paper, and the ink all matched the era. It was not forged, it was simply impossible. More troubling was the location of the birth. The record did not list the cabin, the town, or any nearby settlement. Instead, the birthplace was marked as unverified woods beyond county line, as if whoever filled out the document had no idea where the woman had come from or had chosen not to specify. The midwife's signature was missing as well, replaced by a shaky scrawl that appeared to be the woman's own, suggesting she delivered the child alone. The stranger studied the certificate, noting faint marks across the bottom of the page, indentations from a second set of handwriting, as though someone had pressed another sheet firmly on top of it at some point. When he held it to the light, the ghostly impression of another name emerged, scratched out violently until only shredded fibers remained. What unsettled him most was the realization that this document did not confirm the boy's origins, it unraveled them. The more he examined it, the more it felt like evidence of a deeper secrecy, a story the woman had never intended anyone to uncover. If the boy was not truly her son, or if he was something far more complicated than the simple record suggested, then her later claims about a husband no one had met, about a pregnancy no one understood, became even murkier. The buried certificate seemed less like a forgotten record and more like a desperate attempt to hide a truth she feared would one day force its way back into the light. The storm rolled in faster than the stranger expected, swallowing the last traces of daylight as though the sky itself wanted to drive him toward the cabin. The wind tore through the trees with a low, dragging howl, bending branches until they scraped against each other like ancient bones. Rain followed in violent sheets, forcing him to seek shelter or risk losing the trail entirely. With no choice, he made his way toward the cabin, the same place he had hoped to avoid staying in after nightfall. By the time he reached the warped porch, the storm had grown so fierce that the forest behind him disappeared into a wall of rain, leaving him feeling as though he had stepped out of one world and into another. He pushed the door open, bracing himself against the wind, and entered with a sense of unease already tugging at his spine. Inside, the air felt colder than the storm outside, heavy with the smell of damp wood and something metallic that lingered beneath it. He lit his lantern, the small flame flickering nervously, throwing long shadows across the room. The cabin, though abandoned for years, did not feel empty. His first step onto the creaking floorboards echoed unnaturally, as if the sound traveled farther than the room should allow. He placed his pack near the hearth and tried to ignore the sensation that the darkness pressed closer each time the lantern dimmed. The storm rattled the windows, but above the roar of the wind, he began to hear something else, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. He froze, holding his breath to listen, but the sound faded, replaced by the steady drumming of rain against the roof. Determined not to succumb to nerves, he explored the room with deliberate caution. The journal he had already read lay on the table where he had left it earlier, its pages stirring slightly in the draft, though no wind reached that part of the cabin. A chill crawled along his neck as he remembered the entries describing footsteps and opened windows, the woman's quiet terror etched between the lines. He told himself the noises were part of the storm, the shifting of old timber, the settling of a decaying structure. Yet when he turned toward the narrow staircase leading up to the loft, the lantern's flame elongated suddenly, as if pulled toward the darkness above. Against his better judgment, he climbed the stairs slowly, each creak loud enough to make his pulse quicken. When he reached the loft, he swept the lantern across the small, shadow-filled space. It was empty, no furniture, no belongings, no signs of recent life. But as he stood there, heart pounding, he heard it again. Breathing. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, unmistakable, and far too close. He spun, raising the lantern, but the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by the heavy silence of the storm. For a moment, he could swear the air around him tightened, as if the cabin itself was listening, waiting for his next move. The stranger woke before dawn, though he could not recall falling asleep. The storm had quieted sometime during the night, leaving only the faint drip of water sliding from the roof's broken edge. For a moment he remained still on the stiff cot he had dragged beside the hearth, trying to steady the lingering unease from the sounds he'd heard in the loft. The lantern beside him had burned low, its flame reduced to a weak glow that cast thin, quivering lines across the walls. As he pushed himself upright, he felt the odd sensation that someone had been watching him while he slept, a pressure in the air that clung to him like damp cloth. He tried to shake it off. The storm was over, he told himself. The worst had passed. Yet the heaviness in his chest said otherwise. He stepped outside as the first grey light seeped through the treetops. The world beyond the porch looked washed clean but strangely untouched, as if the storm had blown around the cabin rather than through it. Mist clung to the soil, curling around the stranger's boots like cold fingers. He moved carefully across the clearing, expecting to see fallen branches or mud washed into deep rivulets, but the ground was smooth, undisturbed except for the markings. They appeared in a perfect ring around the cabin, etched into the dirt in thin, looping shapes that looked neither accidental nor natural. At first glance, they resembled animal tracks, but the longer he stared, the more impossible they became. They were too deliberate, too symmetrical, forming patterns no animal would make. Some lines intersected, spiraling inward, while others arched as if drawn by a trembling but intentional hand. The stranger knelt, tracing one of the curved impressions with his fingers. The earth was cool, freshly turned, and unmistakably shaped during the night. Whatever had made these marks had walked the perimeter of the cabin repeatedly, circling it with unsettling patience. He felt a tightening in his throat as he realized the patterns mirrored the ones described in the journal, symbols the woman had once found near the cabin and tried desperately to erase, only for them to return each morning more defined than before. The stranger's breath hitched as he noticed smaller imprints beside the larger ones, almost like the faint outline of bare feet, the toes pointed toward the cabin as if drawn to it. He rose slowly, scanning the tree line. The forest stared back in total stillness, refusing to offer the slightest clue. Yet the silence felt intentional, almost sentient, as though whatever had walked here had slipped back into the shadows the moment the sky began to lighten. He had expected fear, but what he felt instead was a growing certainty that the cabin had not been abandoned at all. Something had circled it while he slept, watching him with the same patience it once reserved for the woman and the boy. And it was not finished. The final realization came slowly, like a fog rolling through the woods, creeping in until it consumed the stranger's every thought. He had spent days piecing together the fragments of a story that the town, the cabin, and even the forest seemed determined to hide. Each clue, the journal, the birth certificate, the vanished man, the pregnant woman, had hinted at a truth too complex to articulate, yet never before had it coalesced with such clarity. As he sat in the cabin, staring at the faint, spiraling marks etched into the dirt outside, he began to see the pattern that had eluded him all along. The pregnancy, the missing son, the repeated symbols in the forest, they were not isolated events. They were threads in a tapestry woven over generations, a twisted legacy that had grown unchecked, shaping lives and deforming histories with quiet inevitability. He thought again of the journal, the trembling words of a mother who had tried to understand a sickness that was not illness, a dependency that was more than human. She had written of the boy, of how his gaze sometimes seemed to carry an older consciousness, something beyond her comprehension, and how the patterns around the cabin, symbols scratched into the earth, marks left on floors and windows, had always returned no matter how she tried to erase them. At the time, the stranger had interpreted these notes as the ramblings of a fearful woman, a mind unraveling in isolation. Now, sitting among the same walls and breathing the same stale air, he realized that her fear had been precise. The patterns were not delusions, they were warnings, maps of an inheritance that refused to stay hidden. The birth certificate he had found, the one buried under needles and soft soil, had first seemed a contradiction, a record at odds with the boy's supposed age. But now he saw it differently. It was a key, a link between generations, a document designed not to deceive but to obscure the mechanics of a cycle that had always repeated itself in secret. The father, the son, the woman herself, none of them were simple roles in a family story. They were actors in a hidden lineage, bound by something ancient and unnatural, something that had thrived in the isolation of the woods. The wind rattled the cabin again, soft this time, carrying with it the faint scent of moss and wet earth. The stranger rose and stepped toward the loft, his eyes lingering on the shadows that clung stubbornly to the corners. He understood now that the pregnancy was not an anomaly in isolation but the latest manifestation of a legacy that had refused to die. Whatever forces had shaped this family over decades, over generations, were not finished. They had waited patiently, silently, for the right moment to reveal themselves, and now, with the woman's return and the signs scattered in the forest, the stranger realized that the story he had chased so desperately was not merely one of human lives gone astray. It was a story alive, still unfolding, and it had been watching him long before he even stepped foot in the woods.